I'm Astrid Kause and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Decision Research at Leeds University Business School and the Priestley International Center for Climate. So my colleagues and me, we study risk communications related to climate and the environment. In this project, we're more precisely interested in how people develop polarized views about climate change and how they use language for communicating about climate change. Our research project is about how very general underlying beliefs about climate influence how we choose reference points in our climate change communications. In order to study that, we need basically two ingredients. We need a numerical climate projection about how extreme weather in the UK is going to be changing, and we need to measure the very general underlying beliefs about climate. So verbal frames are frames that we use for communicating about, for example, risks in everyday language. So just to give you an everyday example, I could describe my glass full of water as either being half full or half empty for describing exactly the same state. But the reference point I use in these two verbal frames is a different one. So if I say a glass is half full, the reference point is that it may be fuller in the future. And if I say it is half empty, it might be emptier in the future. So we are interested in how these types of reference points influence our communications about climate. So both studies that we did in this research project were conducted with US samples. In the first study, we looked at how so-called communicators talk about climate change and summarize climate information for a friend. So very concretely, we presented them with two types of verbal frames for summarizing the same type of climate projection. The first verbal frame described rainfall change in the UK as being as high as 32%. And the second frame they could use was summarize this climate projection as being unlikely to be higher than 32%. So the exactly same statistical information was described with two types of verbal frames. So here we have our first ingredient. The second ingredient was that we measured climate risk perceptions, very general ones that communicators had. Then we asked them to choose one out of two verbal frames. And what we found in this study is that the type of verbal frame about this very specific climate projection they used was correlated with a very general underlying climate risk perception or climate change beliefs. This all wouldn't really matter if listeners would interpret these two frames similarly. So again, with a sample from the United States, we studied how they interpreted these two frames and how their general underlying beliefs changed. So we had our two ingredients again that I mentioned previously. So one experimental group received a climate projection that was described as rainfall change. The likelihood for rainfall change can be as high as 32%. And the second group received a verbal frame that said likelihood for rainfall change is unlikely to be higher than 32%. So again, we had the same statistical information, but using two different verbal frames. Afterwards, we measured general underlying beliefs about climate change with the same scale as in study one. And what we found that the two verbal frames for this very specific type of climate information influence the very general underlying beliefs about climate change. So in sum, the two studies show that people use different verbal frames for communicating climate information, and also that listeners, depending on the verbal frames that are used for climate communications, perceive climate change as a very different thing. So our two studies show that very subtle nuances in the communications about climate change influence very general underlying beliefs. Which means, in other words, that the language we use contributes to polarization processes. And if we now take the results of colleagues into account, so they studied how polarization occurs across chains of people communicating about a risk, which is kind of like a Chinese whisper. So taken together with our results, we can say that these polarization processes are very nuanced and they are embedded into the day-to-day language that we use when we talk about risks such as climate change. We need to find more neutral ways about how to communicate about climate change, and this is what our current research is about. So we have a project where we study how to communicate graphical climate information as well as the language for describing these graphs in neutral ways that allow no space or give no room for polarization. And also, the outcome of this project will be several recommendations for experts for neutrally communicating climate information to general audiences.